Welcome to Module 4. This lecture is all about the Renaissance, the Baroque, and the Rococo periods in art history, and also a little bit about drawing. Your objectives for this module are to identify and discuss drawing media and techniques, explain the cultural and artistic developments of the Renaissance and the Baroque, identify and discuss the stylistic characteristics of these periods in art, and to critically evaluate these periods in art history. Your checklist includes the assigned readings, which are Chapter 16 and Chapter 17. You'll have to take lecture notes from this video and respond to the question prompt at the end of your lecture notes, and then you'll have your discussion reading forum as usual, with an initial post and 2 responses to your classmates' posts. So, ideas of the Renaissance start to percolate in the 14th century, but the period officially began in the 15th century. But Renaissance ideas still influence our lives, not just in the Western world, but in all parts of the world that value technical progress, modern science, and individualism. It's this period from our history, from art history, in which artists increasingly sought new and accurate ways of depicting nature. And this approach has long since informed Western traditions of art. So, Renaissance. What does Renaissance mean? What is the Renaissance? Renaissance, the word, means rebirth, and it's typically thought of as a rebirth or a renewed interest in classical cultures, specifically of Greece and Rome, because Renaissance Italians believed that this was the high point of Western civilization. And so this renewed interest in Greco-Roman culture is a tenet of humanism, this underlying philosophy of much Renaissance art. So, just a little bit of background and cultural context. Italy is really the epicenter or the hub of the Renaissance. And 15th century Italy saw a lot of political and economic fluctuation. There was shifting power between city-states, and we saw the rise of princely courts. And these courts became artistic and cultural centers because wealthy and powerful people were the ones who were paying artists to make art. So their interests really shaped the ideas that permeate this period. And they, one of these ideas that many of them were interested in was humanism. So humanism was this movement in literature and art and philosophy that was all about this growing interest in the natural world. There was emphasis on the individual and humanity's worldly existence. And this is in contrast to the extreme religiosity of the Middle Ages. People that were interested in humanism started to question this extreme religious way of life with logical thought. Now, they weren't opposed to religion. They by no means did humanist scholars reject religion. They were just more they were becoming more interested in secular life, everyday life of humans in the world. They were interested in intellectual pursuits like botany and geology and geography and medicine, engineering, and so forth. And like I said before, they were interested in the classical culture of Greece and Rome, and they just really began to value human concerns and questions over the divine questions that had permeated so much of the thinking in the centuries before. And humanists really stressed the potential value and contributions and talent of individual human beings. They fostered the belief in individual potential, and they often rewarded excellence with fame and prestige and power. So the forces that were shaping culture shifted from God and the divine and heaven to humankind and the present. And this is also the first period that we notice where intellectuals kind of named their own era. They were calling their era the Renaissance. So it's a first example of this kind of like self-reflective behavior. So from humanism, we get these new values combined with technical advances in art that start to bring forth a new style of art in the 14th century. Now, in the medieval period, painting and sculpture were essentially just all about teaching religion, and I think I mentioned that before. So painting and sculpture were just really supplemental to architecture. I've mentioned illuminated manuscripts before, which were these like personal devotional objects of prayer. So when painting and sculpture appeared, it was just in religious institutions. And artists or these anonymous workers who were working on artistic objects in the Middle Ages were not praised as having artistic talent. They were not recognized as artists. They were simply these instruments of God, of the divine. But as we move into the 14th century, these people who were engaging in these kind of pursuits began to think of themselves as individuals possessing creative genius. And again, there was this increased emphasis in faith, growing faith in the potential of the individual. It's also important to note that the Renaissance evolved differently in the northern and southern parts of Europe, because these two regions had different cultural backgrounds. They had different values, different types of art developed in these periods. So the Gothic style reached its kind of height in the north, and while Byzantine and classical influences kind of predominated in the south. So we're going to start by talking about Giotto. Giotto is it is sometimes called a Renaissance artist, but he's really a proto-Renaissance artist. So he's not officially a Renaissance artist, but his work represents a clear break from the medieval traditions that came before. He departed from that Byzantine style that came before him by a number of strategies or qualities in his work. For instance, the figures in his work of art had feelings, and they started to look like real human figures in space. And Giotto also used or was very innovative in his depictions of light and space and mass. And you'll notice that there are some figures in this work with their backs to the viewer, and this is very different from this strict frontal regimen of earlier Byzantine works of art. So in Lamentation from 1305, the beginning of the 14th century, we see this work where Giotto is depicting physical and spiritual subject matter. He's portraying light, space, and mass more naturally than the art that came before. And you have these figures that stand out as individuals in this kind of stage-like space. And this is important because earlier art, each of the figures would be placed kind of just overlapping each other in this frontal position, kind of like a big block or blob of figures. And so when I say that these figures stand out as individuals, we start to see that they have bodies. And you'll notice that the drapery of these figures falls in these shallow, even folds. So they're not exactly true to life, but Giotto is trying, he's moving toward depicting figures more realistically. And certainly in the faces of the figures, we see an expressiveness that we didn't see in earlier Byzantine paintings or works of art. These kind of personal feelings of grief were rarely seen in that medieval art. So Giotto is also avoiding bilateral symmetry. In that earlier medieval or a Byzantine art, if there was a central figure where you'd see 3 figures on the right, there'd definitely be 3 figures on the left as well. I mean, these works were often very symmetrical and just not natural. So we see that Giotto is depicting a strong diagonal in his composition as well. He's experimenting with the possibilities of composition, and he's creating a more lifelike space. So that strong diagonal concentrates our eyes on the head of Christ. And the use of light and shade here gives his figures a kind of volume. So he's really trying to move toward realism and expressiveness, and away from that strictly divine nature of medieval works of art. But again, the Renaissance has not begun yet. So that's why Giotto is considered a precursor of the Renaissance, or the Proto-Renaissance, if you will. But also, he is credited with being the artist who reinvents this naturalistic painting, because it hadn't been practiced since the Roman era. So, excuse me. So, again, if you think about that, looking back to the classical past, and you think about some ideas that we've hit on before, the Greeks were interested in idealism and perfection, and the Romans were more concerned with physical accuracy and portraiture. And artists of the Middle Ages were focused on spiritual concerns completely over physical reality. So in the Renaissance, attention rather, shifts from heavenly subjects to earthly subjects. But artists were still depicting Christian subjects, but in human terms. Some artists portrayed these spiritual beings with the faces of people from the cities around them. So, that is a little bit about Giotto, our proto-Renaissance artist. Now, let's move into the early Renaissance in Italy. An important idea that we'll start to talk about that I've introduced on this slide is the idea of patronage. So wealthy Italian merchants lived in these cities where the Renaissance was percolating, and these wealthy merchants allowed city-states to compete with one another for recognition and for power. So art patrons become very important because, again, they are the people who actually have the money to pay artists to create works of art. Now, also in the early Renaissance, we begin to see a more serious study of anatomy and light and mathematical processes that lead to the development of linear perspective, which I know that you know about because we talked about it when we talked about space. So Masaccio is a great place to start. He is working about 100 years after Giotto, and he's often considered the first major painter of the Renaissance. Masaccio unfortunately died at the young age of 27. But anyway, the Holy Trinity is this very large fresco. Notice that it is almost 22 feet high and 10.5 feet wide. So this was a real altarpiece in a church, and it was created in fresco, which is that painting technique of painting in wet plaster. Now, this is generally accredited as the first painting to be based on a systematic use of linear perspective. And, you know, again, the Romans were using these perspective systems, but it wasn't perfected until, the system wasn't perfected until the 15th century by a contemporary of Masaccio whose name was Filippo Brunelleschi. Now, the Holy Trinity is this work that focuses heavily on the possibilities of composition. This composition is centered on an open chapel, and we see a lot of triangles, which are these underlying structures that bring balance and stability, and we see a lot more of these throughout the Renaissance. The most obvious triangle of this composition starts here at the head of God, and his outstretched arms that kind of hold up the cross on which Jesus Christ hangs make up the two sides of the triangle, and then the post running across forms the base of that major staple triangle. So we see the Holy Trinity here with God, the head of God, the head of Christ, and the Holy Spirit represented as a dove in between. Now down below we see Mary gesturing to her son, and on the opposite we have St. John, and then very significantly kneeling here we have the two art patrons, so the husband and wife who paid for this work of art, who commissioned this work of art. These donor portraits serve as a good point to mention the rise of portraiture, and also that donors like these often hoped that visitors who would come see these works of art, these altarpieces in the church, would see them and pray for their safety in the afterlife. So we have a three-dimensional space here where the vanishing point from that linear perspective is at the base of the cross. And each figure of this composition has a physical and emotional presence. And Masaccio learned this, or he was influenced by Giotto. Now, we also notice that this drapery, as opposed to what you see here, the drapery falling in this like very even folds, it's not very realistic. That's not how clothing hangs off of the body. We see the folds start to become more realistic in Masaccio's work. So these artists are getting better and better at depicting reality. And Masaccio's mathematical use of linear perspective helps to achieve a greater sense of depth and space in the work of art as well. Now, also interesting, important part to note is this sarcophagus with the skeleton. And this inscription translates to, "What you are now, I once was. What I am now, you will one day become." And this is just a reminder of mortality. It's called a memento mori. And these crop up in all kinds of art. So, like I mentioned during the drawing lecture, I'm sorry. In the Middle Ages, nude figures were thought to be sinful and idolatrous. Nudity in general rarely appeared in art. And when they did, they were used like in depictions of Adam and Eve for the sake of discussion of about original sin. But Renaissance artists and intellectuals wanted to take the example of the Greeks and the Romans, though, and raise the status of the nude to a coveted and revered symbol of the divine. Rather than it being something shameful, it was to be a celebrated creation of God and a symbol of human worth and this was in line with the views of humanism. So the nude really became a celebration of and a reflection of God's image. So, we begin to see less clothed figures. And of course, that was acceptable to portray the divine in that way. So this is a starting point here in Masaccio's work. Now, Donatello was essentially the sculptor counterpart to Masaccio. And this is his version of David, created around 1425, between 1425 and 1430. And this work was probably commissioned by the Medici family. The Medicis were the most important patrons of the Italian Renaissance. So remember that name, the Medici family. So the rise of patronage, again, allowed a competitive climate between city-states. And it was primarily wealthy merchant families and bankers like the Medicis who were in power. They dominated culturally and politically and economically. So I've included the term Neoplatonism here. That's just another current of thought that influenced some of these patrons. Neoplatonism is this very in-depth philosophical idea. Essentially, it was the belief that the human could reunite with the divine spirit. It's as if at one time there was just this universal oneness, and then they became separated, and then through the human could through spiritual pursuits could ascend from earthly existence and become one again with the divine. Anyway, if you're interested in such ideas, I encourage you to look up Neoplatonism, but this is just an undercurrent of Renaissance thought. So, if it had been unacceptable to depict nudes for centuries, where do the Renaissance artists look for inspiration and education, at least at first? Well, they looked at Greek and Roman art, or Greco-Roman art. And one specific technique that they took from this study was the idea of the contrapposto, and that's this pose where the weight is counterposed, and it's generally thought of as creating an S curve in the body. So if you see how the weight is shifted to one hip, causing the shoulder to counterbalance that weight, you'll be able to impress your friends with the word contrapposto. So Donatello's David is this bronze figure here that was supposedly the first life-size freestanding nude since the Roman era. This image of David was inspired by the biblical story in that he is a youth, but he meant more. The symbol of David meant so much more than the biblical hero to the Florentines, because Florence was this itty-bitty city-state who stood up to foreign domination. And, David killed the giant Goliath. So David was an important symbol to the Florentines. David was, in Donatello's rendering, less idealized and more naturalistic than the sculptures of ancient Greece. I mean, he wasn't a pagan god or a hero or an athlete, but he was the biblical slayer of Goliath in this depiction, and he's depicted as a slender youth. So this image really celebrates this new humanist reverence for the nude. So what about another painting? This is Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and this is the first large mythological painting since classical antiquity, and it was another Medici commission, and it kind of proves, or it kind of shows, that the Medicis were supported a range of styles and subject matter. They didn't think that a work of art had to be Christian to be beautiful. So as patrons of Botticelli's art, he kind of had a lot of freedom with what he depicted. So this scene portrays the goddess Venus at the moment of her birth. She was the goddess of love, born from sea foam, blown to the shore of the island of Cyprus by the god Zephyr that you see on the left, who was the god of the wind, or god of the breeze. And so Botticelli depicts this ideal female form being blown to the island to be clothed. As she arrives, she's greeted by this female nymph named Pomona, who welcomes her with an embellished shawl. And all of the draperies and the hair kind of undulates in the wind, creating this atmosphere of ease and grace, and it's kind of lyrical, it's kind of poetic. Flowers seem to be floating or hanging in the air behind the figures. And so Botticelli's style was more lyrical. It's tinged with a bit of a romantic flair as well. And it's significant to note that it was destined to be placed on the wall above the marital bed in the Medici home. Also significant are the figure's gestures of modesty that were likely modeled after a classical statue of Venus that was a part of the Medici family collection. So this work combines the classical idealism of Greek sculpture with humanist concerns of introspection and thought and feeling. So you might also notice that this background is decorative and flat and kind of devoid of atmospheric perspective. There's more emphasis here on line than illusionary style. Just think the interest in science and linear perspective in human anatomy were still on the rise. It didn't become this default approach all at one time. So it also must be noted that it was novel to place a nude non-Christian goddess as the central focus of a work of art. But these artists had to, were painting to make a living too, so they had to paint the subject matter that interested their Neoplatonist patrons. So, we discussed a few of the artists that we associate with the Renaissance. So we're going to just slide on over into the High Renaissance, the peak of Italian art during the Renaissance. So the High Renaissance really occurs in Rome and Venice, typically, and then the early Renaissance takes place in Florence. But we're going to focus here on three artists, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. So Da Vinci is the quintessential Renaissance man. I'm sure that you're familiar with the term Renaissance man. This is a term that means a person that has many interests. Art was only one of many interests that Da Vinci had. So we focus on Leonardo as an artist, but if you take note of his other pursuits, it can enhance your understanding of his artistic production. So, Da Vinci was this avid draftsman and note taker and sketch artist. His sketches deal with botany, geology, geography, cartography, which is map making, zoology, and more. All of these kind of inform Da Vinci's art. His scientific investigations make him a better painter. So his in-depth studies gave him a better understanding of perspective and color and light. So some might even say that, drawings like these could be finished works in and of themselves. So let's go on to talk about the Mona Lisa. That's probably the most widely well-known painting in the world. And before we get too in-depth in our discussion of the next two works, I just want you to know that Da Vinci didn't actually complete that many paintings in his lifetime. Especially compared to other artists, there are less than 20 surviving works that can definitely be attributed to him as far as paintings go. So the Mona Lisa, despite the uncertainty surrounding the sitter's identity, this work is still a very important representation of Renaissance notions of the individual being worthy of a portrait. So this is a far cry from the kind of anonymity of individuals in the Middle Ages. But it did kind of harken back to the practice of Roman portraiture. So the sitter here wears no jewelry, nor does she display any other sign of visible status or wealth. She sits quietly with her hands folded, with this kind of curious smile on her face, and very significantly, she stares directly at the viewer. If you think about Botticelli's work, the artist is the figure is displayed modestly, and she's averting the gaze of the viewer. But the Mona Lisa stares directly at the viewer. And this goes against the rules of etiquette that dictated a woman should not look into a man's eyes. So what might seem like an unassuming kind of portrait of a simple young woman, to our learned eyes, this was actually quite a bold representation or work of art from the age that it came from. And then another aspect that makes this work so interesting and kind of mysterious is this uninhabited landscape behind the Mona Lisa. And this very dark and hazy atmosphere is characteristic of Da Vinci's work. And he uses this form of chiaroscuro that he invented called sfumato. And it's simply a way of adjusting the light and value gradations to make things appear kind of blurry and smoky and mysterious. So let's look at the Last Supper. This is another iconic work by Da Vinci. And your book emphasizes that in comparison to earlier representations of Christ, this one really illustrates the impact of humanism. Now, your book asks us to compare Da Vinci's Last Supper with this earlier Byzantine portrayal of Christ. Christ as Pantocrator. And this is this giant mosaic where Jesus is the king of heaven, rather, and he's all powerful, looking down on earth. But in contrast, in Da Vinci's work, Christ is depicted on earth amongst his people. He is an accessible being. So this reinforces the currents of humanism that underpin much of the artistic production of this period, the human relationship and interaction with the divine. So Da Vinci also attempted to capture this very specific moment when Christ had just revealed that one of his disciples is going to betray him. And this is very different than other depictions of the Last Supper because the focus is usually on sharing the bread and the wine, or the Eucharist. So you see in this diagram a stormy swirl of emotion rippling around Christ. Now, the faces of the figures show shock and disbelief and anger, and Judas here appears taken aback as well. So this moment comes right before the birth of the Eucharist. During this hubbub of reactions, Christ calmly outstretches his arms to form this perfect, stable triangle at the center of the composition. So again, this is a great example of the epitome of humanist ideals with the content and the technical advances. We have linear perspective here illustrated in this diagram. And it leads our eyes right to the head of Christ. So what about Michelangelo Buonarroti? You could also pronounce his name Michelangelo or Michelangelo. I've heard both. So, like the Last Supper, Michelangelo's David is a seminal work that represents a lot of important Renaissance ideas. And I mentioned this before, but again, the biblical hero of David was an important symbol of freedom from tyranny for Florence. So, let's look at these three Davids before we delve into Michelangelo's. Sorry, students, I get really thirsty making these lectures. So, You'll notice right away, if you've read your chapters all along, that this picture of the center is not in your book. This is Verrocchio's David, but I wanted to include it in this PowerPoint or this video for your reference. You can tell that it was inspired by Donatello's, but Verrocchio's is much more modest, considering that he's dressed up in this kind of tunic. And I'm sorry, some scholars suggest that it was modeled after a young Da Vinci, who was a student of Verrocchio's. And it was also commissioned by the Medici. It's just more traditional and safe. It doesn't make the same kind of splash as Donatello's on the left or Michelangelo's on the right. Donatello's David was young and beautiful. Michelangelo's David was a more powerful figure, more heroic, more of a defender than just this beautiful, idyllic figure. Now, it's significant, though, to consider the intended areas of display for these two works of art. Donatello's sculpture here was destined for the Medici garden, so it was informed by private tastes. It emphasized beauty and divinity and sensuality of the human form. He's almost feminized here. But Michelangelo's was destined to be in the public square of Florence. So we see more psychological energy, more tension before the moment of action, contemplation before the battle. We see a prelude to action, perhaps having more of an impact or the impression of a heroic figure. So again, the artist took the contrapposto stance from classical Greek sculpture. His torso slightly bent too, adding drama to the figure. And the position of his hands and the expression on his face. The tension in his furrowed brow and this kind of the ferocity of his gaze all serve as departures from the idealism of Greek sculpture. And of course from medieval precursors, because nudity was wholly new. So despite the traditional association of David with heroism, Michelangelo chose to, depict the young biblical warrior, not after this victory with the head of Goliath at his feet, like these figures, but before the moment of action. His depiction of David has disrupted the self-contained compositions of earlier renderings. His head is turned toward his adversary, and he's interacting compositionally and emotionally outward. And this sculpture solidified the artist's reputation as an extraordinary talent in his time and since then. So I'm gonna skip a couple of slides because I need to talk to you about, well, no, I'll go ahead and talk to you about drawing. Let's think for a moment how important drawing is to the creative process. While drawing dates back to prehistory, like in the cave drawings I mentioned earlier in this semester, and the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all drew to decorate the walls of their temples and tombs and pottery, we don't start to notice drawing as a preparatory tool until the Middle Ages. So again, most art of the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, was produced to glorify God and teach religion. You might recall again, this is an illuminated manuscript. Those prayer books used for devotion, they were beautifully decorated manuscripts, hand lettered on vellum initially, and then later on paper. Vellum is calfskin. So some artists used preparatory drawings during this time, but it wasn't as prevalent as in the Renaissance, because paper wasn't made in Europe until the early 12th century. And early on, it was expensive and kind of hard to obtain. Prior to paper, these artists might draw on animal skins like parchment or vellum, but those were also expensive. Sometimes they used other materials like wood or wax. They might throw these away or reuse them. So there's less surviving examples of preparatory drawings from this time period. So I included these drawings just for fun. I don't know if you guys have seen any of the medieval art memes, but they are hilarious. And another common use for drawing in the Middle Ages was that the artists would frequently record images that they would be using over and over again in those illuminated manuscripts. They'd record them in reference or model books, and then they wouldn't have to draw from nature or models. So I just included this little medieval doodle and this funny guy who's getting stabbed in the head who's super bored, and another example of an illuminated manuscript who, all of this is hand drawn and hand lettered. So by the 1400s in Italy, paper had become much easier to obtain. So this allowed a new importance for drawing to develop. Renaissance artists developed a special love for drawing. So we see a steady increase in the number of drawings produced. Drawing came to be considered the foundation for work in all the arts. It became useful for studying nature, especially, particularly the human body. And this is also when we see artists start to draw more and more from nude models. And that's why portrayals of the human figure became increasingly realistic. So this drawing by Michelangelo of a reclining male nude is a perfect example of such a study. This was a preparatory drawing for the creation of Adam, which we'll discuss shortly, one of the scenes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo is a master of portraying human anatomy, but he didn't start out with that much genius. He worked on his craft carefully, relentlessly practicing. And you can see this in the multiple depictions of the figure's hands in this drawing. The need for preparatory drawings grew increasingly during the Renaissance as well. In Italy, many large-scale paintings or frescoes were commissioned to adorn the interiors of churches and palaces and public buildings. And again, fresco is this type of painting that's done rapidly in watercolor on wet plaster, so that the colors would penetrate the plaster to become fixed as it dries, but it dries really quickly. So drawings were a really important step in preparing to create the finished work. It was a way to practice before beginning to paint. So most of the time, artists of the Renaissance were using black and red chalks, which were softer materials, or charcoal, so they could make large drawings very fast. And so they preferred these chalks and charcoals over wet media or ink. So also this concept of the cartoon, the original meaning of this term was a full-size drawing made as a guide for a larger work in another medium, such as in a mural, a mosaic, or a tapestry. And we know cartoon has a different meaning today, but that's just a little crash course on the importance of drawing in the Renaissance and how it became such a significant tool for artists. So I'm getting a little hoarse, excuse me. So The Sistine Chapel, this other monumental, very well-known work by Michelangelo. Pope Julius II had to beg Michelangelo to work on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The artist was upset because the Pope had formerly commissioned him to work on a massive project that would be the Pope's own tomb. So Michelangelo was going to get to work on 28 statues for this work of art, or for this tomb. And he was really excited about that because he loved sculpting. He valued sculpting more than painting. But shortly after he began working on that project, the Pope suspended his work for unclear reasons, although he probably diverted funds to help rebuild St. Peter's. So by the time Michelangelo was actually able to finish the tomb, many years later, the scale of the project was much, much smaller. Anyway, that's why he was upset, but eventually he began work on the Sistine Chapel in 1508, and he finished it 4 years later. And he faced great challenges in painting this ceiling, including its grand dimensions, which were 5,800 square feet and 70 feet off the ground. And there were going to be tremendous perspective problems because of the curvature of the ceiling and its height. And the first section he did had to be redone. But again, he met all of these challenges and produced this unprecedented work that combined his patron's agenda, church doctrine, and his own artistic interests. So the most prevalent themes in the Sistine Chapel ceiling are the creation, the fall, and the redemption of humanity. To tell these stories, he wove together more than 300 figures. And each of these figures display Michelangelo's interest in the expressive potential of the human body. The body was more than just beautiful in its physical form to Michelangelo. It also had great spiritual and philosophical significance. And he captured these bodies with a sculptor's eye for how light and shadow play across the body's volume and surface. So the most famous panel from the Sistine Chapel ceiling is the creation of Adam. This very humanistic interpretation of the momentous event where the hand of God literally sparks life. And this work underscored the look back to Greco-Roman mythology because of the relationship between gods and heroes. So this was a bold representation of how easily high Renaissance thought or thinking could join classical and Christian traditions, but the message was not bastardized. It wasn't obscured. So now some scholars think that this female figure under God's left arm represents the manifestation of Eve that is to come, and others think that she represents the Virgin Mary and that the Christ child is depicted at her knee. But the takeaway here is that three important features are intrinsic to Michelangelo's style. The reclining positions of the figures, the heavy musculature, and the twisting poses. So let's talk a little bit about our last of the three high Renaissance artists, Raphael. His work epitomizes the quiet grandeur and balance of the Renaissance. It also embodies clarity and grace and dignity. And it often features these monumental shapes or pyramids activated by dynamic figures, and they're kind of infused with the clear, even light. Raphael was often seen as a rival to Michelangelo, who supposedly didn't like the artist and felt even that Raphael plagiarized his work. And Raphael was probably influenced by Leonardo da Vinci in actuality. So his paintings skillfully portray the divine and spiritual qualities of humanity. So we're looking at the School of Athens right now, which we looked at earlier in the semester when we were talking about linear perspective. This is a grand composition of harmoniously arranged forms in a rational space. We see a calm dignity in the figures. And we see an influence of Greco-Roman sculpture in the variety and the energy of the poses as well. Now, this composition revolves around Plato and Aristotle, who are just perfectly framed by a trompe-l'oeil arch. And as we have previously discussed, through the use of linear perspective, our eyes trace the perspective lines or orthogonals back to help us focus our view on these figures. And this work of art was commissioned as a part of a series to hang on the wall in the Vatican Palace. And it was meant to be inspirational to the people who would meet there. Now, it was a quintessential expression of Renaissance beliefs. And it perfectly elevates human reason by presenting philosophical discussion among learned people as an ideal. Or in other words, it promotes a new ideal of intellectual or philosophical discussion among educated people, and there are supposedly figures representing each of the subjects one must master to have such a debate, like astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and so on. Some say that this figure is meant to represent Michelangelo, but we don't know for certain. Now, your book includes this work, Paul Preaching at Athens, which you can read more about in your own book. But I will say that this is one of a series of cartoons for tapestries that were supposed to hang on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. The tapestries don't hold up well over time, but we do have these cartoons left. Now, I wanted to include one more work by Raphael, just because I thought that you might recognize it or elements of it. This is the Sistine Madonna, and it's perhaps the most thoroughly discussed and analyzed work by Raphael, although interpretations are quite varied and ambiguous. These open curtains are a trompe-l'oeil device. If you remember, that is that French phrase meaning to fool the eye, referring to the illusionistic qualities of works of art that were so real that they are meant to fool the viewer. Anyway, these curtains are kind of strange. It seems as though they're used to reveal this kind of sacred vision of holy people, but only temporarily. So that's why it's kind of ambiguous and still up for debate, because we don't understand why Raphael included them. Now, some people believe that this model, the female model, Madonna, was Raphael's mistress at the end of his life. And some say that these two precious angels or cherubs at the bottom here were modeled after the children of the mistress, who would watch their mother as the artist worked. And they are quite famous images all on their own. Now, there has been a lot of speculation about the scared looks on the faces of the two main figures. And why the figure of Saint Sixtus is pointing towards the viewer. But apparently the original intended location of the artwork was behind a choir screen, which is this architectural structure that would have had a crucifix on it. So the mother and child then would have been looking at the Son and the self, respectively, on the cross, witnessing this terribly sad scene. And I included this term here, stable triangle, because Raphael's works are typically arranged very carefully with the stable triangle. That's kind of the influence of Da Vinci that's often referred to. And also there's a sense of balance in Raphael's works. Now, oh, and I just wanted to draw your attention for a moment to the angels at the bottom of the screen. That's the part that I thought you might recognize. I've seen these angels depicted in all kinds of ready-to-purchase art in places like Kirkland's and Ross, and they adorn the covers of many journals. So they have infiltrated popular culture. So let's move into the Renaissance of Northern Europe. Now, it's important to note that this is not the same as the Italian Renaissance. Again, because there are different cultural backgrounds at play. But these geographic locations, these different countries were experiencing developments in painting, and they were experiencing a renaissance of sorts. But they weren't really influenced by the same kind of Greco-Roman ideas, but instead they were growing out of medieval traditions of illuminated manuscripts and stained glass. The northern countries were experiencing changes, just not the same as in Italy. So while the early Renaissance is unfolding in Italy, though, the concurrent movement in Northern Europe is also concerned with depicting life in the real world. So Jan van Eyck is probably the most celebrated painter of this period, a Flemish painter from Flanders. This is a region of present-day Belgium. And this is his most famous work, and also the most debated work from Van Eyck. But this artist is often attributed as the first to explore the advent of oil painting. All the predominant kinds of painting or paint that came before were fresco and egg tempera painting. Now, egg tempera painting was essentially pigment, which are these powdery colored substances mixed with egg, and so it was quick drying, as was fresco, and so that presented a range of challenges for the artists. That oil painting oil painting allowed a lot more flexibility, and it was slow drying. So the pigments, those same powders, would be mixed with linseed oil. And oil painting yielded this really refined texture and consistency and application, and again flexibility and brilliance of color as well. Now, the work of Jan van Eyck was much admired and imitated by other artists, and so Van Eyck painted on small wooden panels because he didn't have to paint on such a large scale, because he could achieve greater detail and these the illusion of texture, and but Northern Renaissance artists were not operating, not using the same kinds of mathematical systems of spatial planning and depth, like linear perspective. They were working more intuitively, but still able to achieve the illusion of depth, and using directional light, creating mass and the physical likenesses of real people. And human figures just took on this new, incredibly real likeness, and interior settings as well. So let's talk about the Arnolfini portrait. Again, this work confuses scholars, and has for hundreds of years, because we're still just not 100% clear. Opinion about it goes back and forth. It's commonly thought to represent a wedding or a betrothal, but we just don't know for sure because we don't know the identity of these people. There are lots of ordinary objects portrayed in this painting that may seem rather insignificant, but each of them has symbolic value. Remember when we went over iconography, there are a lot of examples of iconography in this painting. So what are some examples of those? Well, the chandelier and the rug that you see behind the female here, these sandals, the robes of these figures, the little dog, the oranges here, all of these are symbols of wealth. Your book suggests that this singly lit, I don't know if that's correct, if this single candle lit in the chandelier represents the seeing eye of God. These amber rosary beads here to the left of the mirror represent purity. Some say that this little dog represents fidelity. And I wonder, do you think this female looks pregnant here? Well, she definitely does look pregnant, but common belief is that she is just holding up the drapery of the fabric of the drapery, to perhaps suggest that she is willing to bear children. And you can go on and on about more of the details of this work of art. But you'll also notice the signature of the artist here above the mirror. And if this is indeed a scene portraying a marriage, this could have actually been the marriage contract, and therefore Van Eyck's signature would have indicated his role as a witness to the marriage as well. And lastly, this work really represents this concept that we call a window into the world of a scene, because it looks so realistic. Now, let's talk about Albrecht Dürer, who is a prominent painter in Germany during the time of the Holy Roman Empire, and he is essentially the Michelangelo of this area. He is certainly as studious and analytical, observant, and confident as Michelangelo. And he is, I'm sorry. Oh, patrons in this area are interested in portraits of themselves, so that's significant to for thinking about the area that he's practicing in. And he was skilled in gold work and stained glass and design, painting and printmaking, but he was mostly known for his printmaking, and we'll talk more about that later in the semester. He also was well traveled. He went to Italy and brought back knowledge of the Italian techniques of perspective and figure drawing, and wrote about them and disseminated his works. And he also bought into this belief, this increasing belief that the artist was a creative individual rather than just a laborer or a wage worker. And he embodies this belief in several self-portraits. In this one, he represents himself as an idealized, almost Christ-like figure, fully frontal, like an icon. And notice how his hair creates the stable triangle. He kind of looks out intently of the picture plane into the eyes of the viewer. He appears thoughtful, confident, spiritual. And this work also may indicate, or he may have intended for it to indicate that he is an artist, because the right hand was generally associated as being the one that holds the paintbrush, and the marten fur of his coat was a common material used in paintbrushes during that time. So we also have to think about how the Protestant Reformation affects the production of art in Northern Europe. So this is the era in the early 16th century when Pope Leo X excommunicates Martin Luther from the Roman Catholic Church for his 99 Theses. So, we see a rise of Protestantism, and so the clergy of the Protestant churches discouraged highly decorated interiors. So that led to a major drop in commissions for altarpieces and religious decorations. So we see in this period a lot more private consumption of art and more variety in subject matter because of that. So let's look at this work by Peter Bruegel. This artist develops a broad sense of composition and spatial depth while experimenting with depictions of landscape. And he has as I stated before, he's experimenting with different subject matter. He's kind of far beyond the depictions of the divine, partly influenced by cultural factors and partly influenced by personal interests. But he's more interested in depicting this secular life, everyday life, and what common people are partaking in, what they're doing with their lives. And this is called genre painting. And you have to take into account that landscapes were not a common subject matter at this time. So this looks very, this doesn't look special to our trained eyes because we're so used to seeing things like this. But at the time, this was quite different. So Bruegel creates this series of paintings, one for each month of the year, depicting activities of normal people, of peasants even, the lower wage working kind of people. So this is the January painting called Hunters in the Snow, and it's probably the most highly regarded of the series. And it shows peasants hunting to get food to eat for the winter. So he's exploring how the seasons affect the daily activities of normal people. We see the footsteps of these people in the bottom left corner, and we see what looks like people ice skating. It's just really a really wonderful rendering of a winter landscape, and this illusion of deep space. We see hints of atmospheric perspective here. This was inspired by, he was a well-traveled artist. So let's talk briefly about the late Renaissance and Mannerism. So Palladio, that's who we're thinking about here. He is a Venetian architect who is the most influential architect of his time. And he derived most of his inspiration from Roman architecture. And his designs were published in several books that were widely circulated in the Western world, and he's been emulated for ever since, but especially for the next 2 centuries. And these books were very practical, despite being slightly theoretical. They were much easier to understand than the kinds of architectural treatises that came before. Thomas Jefferson has one of the first copies of his books in America. His designs were characterized by harmonious symmetry and a rejection of ornamentation. This is the Villa Rotunda in Vicenza, Italy, and he designed several of these villas during his early career. Although these structures were originally designed as working farms, this one was meant to be a place for relaxation and partying. So there are 4 identical sides, complete with porches that resemble the facades of ancient temples, and it's built around a central domed hall. So again, it wasn't really intended as a living space, but it was more like this open summer house for socializing for a retired wealthy nobleman. And one could enjoy 4 different views of the countryside from this kind of hilltop position. So at the time of Palladio in Venice, this was really the last surge of great Renaissance art. Venetian painters experiment with poses and compositions and subject matter. They respond to their patrons' wishes and interests. And they were made wealthy from Mediterranean trade. So the patrons wanted their paintings to reflect that new wealth of theirs and that lavish lifestyle. So the works that came out of this period were less idealized than the work of the central Italian artists like Raphael and Michelangelo. So students, I want to let you know that this video is going a little long, so you are required to take notes through the end of mannerism, but then if you decide to take notes after mannerism, starting with the Baroque, you'll get some extra credit points. Now, you'll still be responsible for learning, for reading about the Baroque and the Rococo on your own to respond to the rest of the prompts in this module, your discussion reading, for instance. But because this video is getting a little long, I just want you to know you're only required to take notes up to the point of the Baroque. But I highly suggest you continue watching the video. Maybe you can come back to it later. But I'm going to repeat one more time. If you want extra credit points, continue to take notes through the end of the video. I highly suggest that you do this to get some extra points. But you can stop taking notes when I begin the Baroque. But again, you'll need to know the concepts, you'll need to know about the period to respond to all parts of this module. So, just going to tell you briefly about this painting by Veronese. This was originally supposed to be a Last Supper, and the Last Supper was a really powerful image in the 16th century, so it's not surprising to see yet another version. But Veronese depicted Jesus Christ amongst these drunken revelers, and religious people in the community were not happy, and he was called before the Inquisition, and underwent one of the first important trials of artistic freedom. I kind of got all tongue twisted. So the inquisitors asked why there were drunkards and buffoons and dwarfs and other vulgarities depicted in this painting. And the artist replied that he felt he should be able to freely interpret and depict subjects as he chose. And he was ordered to change it, but rather than change the painting, he just changed the name of it to The Feast in the House of Levi, who was a tax collector. And so this was just kind of his modest revenge. Now, Mannerism, this was the period that followed the Renaissance. Artists working in the shadow of the masters, like Raphael and Michelangelo, were uncertain about how to proceed. So Mannerism developed, and it was sometimes thought of as this anti-classical style. It was a confusing term, often interpreted very differently, but generally used to describe this period following the Renaissance and preceding the Baroque. At first, it was kind of a pejorative or a negative term, implying over-elaboration or distortion. They do appear to be very imbalanced works of art, and they have a strange quality. They often defy analysis or explanation. This is a typical example shown to describe Mannerism by Parmigianino, the Madonna with the long neck. So you see this elongated neck, long fingers, and this very large infant, an imbalanced composition with all of these figures huddled on one side, and this strange depiction of Saint Jerome in the bottom right corner that was specially requested by the patron. But essentially, this artist just wanted to do something different, as if to say that the master's way was not the only way. And then here you see the work of Pontormo. You see a kind of disturbing psychological tension, and this is the deposition from the cross, where Jesus Christ is being taken down from the cross. Notice the grief-stricken looks on these the faces of the figures, and the strange use of color, and this kind of indefinite or warped, unreal sense of space in which the figures are hovering. So you can stop taking notes here just because the video is getting a little long, but I am about to talk about very important works of art, very important movements in art for you to be able to finish the rest of your work. So you'll have to depend on your book if you do not finish the video, but the lecture notes, you are only required to take notes up until this point. So let's discuss the Baroque. This is the period where artists use Renaissance techniques to take art in the direction of more drama, emotion, and splendor. And this covers the period from about 1600 to 1770. We see more variety of style. We see intensity, complexity, great energy and feeling. It's quite the departure from the quiet grandeur of the Renaissance. This period is all about drama and spectacle, and works that attempt to involve the viewer. Also, you might think theatrical depictions are in relation to the Baroque. A sense of dynamism or the use of strong diagonals, as well as intense light and dark contrast. So many characteristics of the Baroque were promoted by the Counter-Reformation. So the Roman Catholic Church responds to the Protestants. They want to restore Catholicism, and they used art as a tool to entice and teach. They wanted to reaffirm the mysteries of the sacraments and religious experience, and they wanted to glorify the saints and encourage the arts as aids to prayer. So the Baroque reunites art with the church. So you see a lot of innovation and curves and drama in the use of light and scale and composition in these works of art. Caravaggio is who we'll discuss first. He is the quintessential Baroque artist. He is the master, and he is also the bad boy of art history. You should look him up in your spare time. You'll notice a down-to-earth realism in his works. He was criticized for being too real and gritty and raw because he used normal people. He used real people. His models were people from the street sometimes. So his dramatic use of light became very influential on other Baroque painters in both the North and the South. I showed you guys the Taking of the Christ as an example of an artist using chiaroscuro when we were covering the visual elements. So this is the Conversion of St. Paul. And in the vein of involving the viewer, look how Paul kind of appears to be coming out of the composition at the viewer. Here, Caravaggio was using light to imply this kind of blinding flash that symbolize this kind of sudden, soul-shattering conversion, or this climactic moment of conversion. It's a very immediate, dramatic, theatrical work, theatrical moment. Yet it's just an everyday person in the midst of this extraordinary event. So, light here is almost like a spotlight, used like a spotlight. And this dramatic use of light is called tenebrism. So that is a term that you need to remember and associate with Caravaggio. Also, the concept of foreshortening, I should have included that on this list, is significant here. It's a method of representing an object in a picture in depth. So you should definitely look that term up as well. So this subject matter is presented in a very close view. So again, that reinforces the idea, the perception that the viewer is a part of that space. This mood of spiritual intervention or the occurrence of mystical experience in the ordinary world is very different, for instance, than that depiction of Paul preaching by Raphael from the High Renaissance, just as a way to kind of think about the development across these art periods. So Bernini was the quintessential Baroque sculptor of this period, and he was also a playwright and active in theater, so he definitely has that theatrical, dramatic quality to his work. So this work was created in 1623, and this work was life-size rather than monumental. So in that way, the viewer feels like he is could be engaging with this work of art. So especially in contrast to like Michelangelo's monumental depiction of David. And rather than capturing the moment before the battle, like Michelangelo, we're not in that tense moment leading up to. We are in the moment of action here. Bernini captures David mid-swing. And also, this is the body is contorted in a twisting motion consistent with Baroque aspirations. And you see this very concentrated, intense look on the figure's face. And here we have the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, depicting one of the great mystical saints of the Counter-Reformation. And this is a life-size depiction of a saint having one of her visions as she recorded it in her diary. It depicts this moment she envisioned of an angel piercing her heart with a fire-tipped arrow, giving her great pain and pleasure all at once. And this expression is often described as sensual or sexual, but it's all about divine love. Bernini's vivid depiction of this scene conveys that great expression of divine love through the physical. And the skylight above works in a similar fashion as Caravaggio's Conversion of St. Paul. We see this characteristic use of light from above, and it kind of emphasizes her flowing drapery. This drapery is just absolutely magnificent. So we see this recreation of spiritual experience in art that was meant to inspire followers. Now, it's also important to note that Bernini was a devout Catholic as well. So he was invested in the efforts of the Counter-Reformation to bring people back to the church through the use of art. So, what about the Baroque in other countries? Peter Paul Rubens was the most important Flemish Baroque painter. He was very studied. He studied the work of the Italians, including Caravaggio. He was known for these exuberant nudes and very sensual depictions of the body. The Raising of the Cross, made in the early 17th century, was one of his first major commissions. And this piece was a triptych, which is a term meaning an artwork made of 3 panels, as it is suggested down here. And this was the central panel of that work. And it was painted for an important Roman Catholic cathedral after he visited Italy and studied the greats. So at the center, you'll see these Herculean bodies holding up the cross with these incredibly taut, muscular bodies. So all the drama of the Baroque here is mixed with Peter Paul Rubens' very own unique ideal of thematic and formal unity. And the realism and the rich colors are influential of, or indicative of, his Flemish background. The rich colors and the surface realism, but the intense emotion, I mean, wow. Look at the face of Jesus Christ. This intense emotion shows debt to Italian art, as well as the diagonally arranged composition. So that is Peter Paul Rubens. Also notice this high degree of realism in the foliage and the dog. That's that Flemish influence, and the blue of this drapery and the red of this drapery are just awe-inspiring. So in the Netherlands, this period saw a rise in a new kind of art patron. So the wealthy middle-class merchants and bankers here were mostly Protestant, and they preferred more of that everyday kind of subject matter, like we saw in Peter Bruegel's work earlier. The genre scenes, landscapes, portraits, and works of still life, or a painting in which the subject is arranged on a tabletop, like fruits or flowers, or other domestic items. I'm sure you're familiar with these. So Vermeer is one of the most intriguing Dutch painters, who painted only for local art patrons, and he was kind of this mysterious artist who was absolutely a perfectionist, and his works are characterized by meticulous detail. So rather than using light to heighten dramatic content like Caravaggio, Vermeer used light to reveal color and texture and incredible detail of the physical world. And he seemed to favor these enigmatic scenes of women in their homes alone or with a servant, occupied with domestic or cultivated kind of activities like writing or reading. Most works have a similar kind of, there's a similar set of characteristics. These quiet interiors with low-key colors. This one's kind of on the brighter end, and they're asymmetrical, but they're very geometric in their overall organization. And emotion is normally subdued. So in the kitchen maid here, we see an everyday domestic scene of a female maidservant pouring milk in the kitchen. But the use of color and natural light make this very mundane act so beautiful. Look at how the bright light fills this room, and I've just included a few details so you can see he really heightens the sense of brightness by including these little specks of bright or lightly colored paint all over the composition. You see little ones here and across her bodice here on the milk jug. It's just incredible. And here's an even closer detail. It's just gorgeous. Gorgeous, gorgeous. And as far as his attention to detail, I mean, if you think about this image, it looks so clean and pristine. And side note, here is a still life scene within this larger work. But you see this place looks pretty immaculate, with the exception of whatever this object is. But you'll notice these very interesting details, like the wall has a blemish here, and there is a broken window pane here on the left. But his works are just beautiful and almost it's just unreal, the degree of detail in these works of art. So lastly, we're going to look at, and this is our one slide for the Rococo. By the early 18th century in France, the Italian Baroque style had given way to the Rococo, this light, playful version of the Baroque that was the favored style of the aristocracy, that devoted itself to the enjoyment of these superficial pleasures, including witty conversation and playful sensuality. It's characterized, the Rococo, is characterized by elaborate ornamentation and asymmetry, pastel colors, curved and serpentine lines, delicate forms, dainty figures, and it commonly depicts themes of love, classical myths, youth, and other playful themes. It was particularly suited to those extravagant lifestyles of the wealthy and aristocratic French courts. So this is The Swing by Fragonard, or as your book calls it, Happy Accidents of the Swing. You'll see that a lot, works of art referred to with slightly different names and slightly different years sometimes as well. History is a process, is always it's in flux. It's never quite set in stone. Anyway, The Swing is this quintessential example of Rococo painting, and it's certainly one of the most well-known works by Fragonard. It's a somewhat risque composition of this very lush forest crowded with statuary and plants, depicting a young woman on a swing being pushed by her husband on the right side of the composition, kind of in the shadows, who does not realize that there is another man in the bushes on the left side who is looking up the skirt of his wife. But it seems like this little lady here knows exactly what's going on. So as you can see, the subject matter of the Rococo period has evolved or devolved into very different territory. So that is our crash course in the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Rococo, and just a brief tidbit on drawing. So I encourage you to do your assigned readings, and I hope that some of you have chosen to watch the entire video to get some extra credit points. It will be 15 extra credit points. So please consider taking notes throughout the video. Now I'm going to go ahead and make it 20 extra points. And then respond to the lecture prompt and complete the rest of